return to school next week because of the surge in coronavirus cases. Other unions are calling for all lessons to move online. A senior government advisor has defended plans to push back the second round of COVID vaccinations from 3 weeks to 3 months. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has claimed the pandemic began in multiple parts of the world, not just in China. BBC News.
And the news is read by Jane Steele. At 2 o'clock, the Time Machine takes us back 40 years to January 1981, with news, music, archive recordings, even the memories of Radio 4 listeners. Join the comedian Doc Brown as he learns about a time he's far too young to remember. That's at 2.
Bunk bed.
He has taken to burrowing his snout, and I can't tell you how disturbing it is in the middle of the night.
The return of Patrick Marber and Peter Curran's series of Sleepy Wonders.
I didn't want to say anything because I was worried things were taking a spiritual turn for you.
With late night guests including Guy Garvey.
The first time Rach and I slept in a bed together, she had an eye mask, earplugs and a gum guard.
Bunk Bed, this Wednesday night at 11 on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
Chris Mason returns with any questions this time next Saturday. Now, though, here's Lise Doucette with our correspondent's look ahead.
Greetings to all as a new year begins at last. Has there ever been a year like 2020? A year when so many of us have counted the days until it was over. A year when the world as we knew it was changed, perhaps forever, and where so many lives were sadly shattered. 2020 will be remembered as the year the coronavirus upended our lives wherever we live. It was also a year when British and European leaders talked night and day to reach a trade deal, and when the United States of America became ever more divided, and in some places, violently so. As always, there was some good in so much bad. The Black Lives Matter movement put injustice and diversity on the agenda as never before, and the pandemic focused minds on saving not just lives, but our planet in our climate emergency. What then does 2021 hold in store? Does the stunning success in the search for a vaccine promise a new start? Or will the virus keep moving and mutating? Will President Biden reshape America and countries beyond now that President Trump is gone? But wait, is he gone? And what will be the main flashpoints and fault lines around the world? As always, we have the best of our BBC analysts and astrologers here to help us navigate these uncharted waters. It's been a tough 2020, even for the correspondents. So I'll start gently. Tell us who you are. Starting with myself, of course, I'm Lise Doucette, the BBC's chief international correspondent. And with me, socially distanced, is
Gabriel Gatehouse. I'm Newsnight's international editor.
And this is Aline McBool, North America correspondent here in my home in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Darshini David in London, the BBC's global trade correspondent, but actually I've spent most of the year monitoring the biggest crisis for our economy in 300 years.
I'm Justin Rowlatt. I'm in my home in London. I'm the BBC's chief environment correspondent.
I'm Katya Adler. I'm the BBC's Europe editor, where I live and work in Brussels.
Welcome to all of you. Now, please, for all of us, for all of our listeners, please expertly answer the question on so many minds. When will life, as we knew it, the world before the pandemic, return? Gabriel.
The spring? I hope. I don't know. I'm not a health correspondent, but look, we've just got this new strain that everyone says is much more virulent. We don't know whether it's more deadly, but certainly it's affecting all of our travel plans, our Christmas plans. So I don't know. The spring?
Aline?
Well, things are looking pretty bleak. We're having all this excitement around the vaccine, but the highest numbers of deaths or in terms of people in hospital in the US and cases is happening right now. And it does sound bleak, but medical officials are talking about the equivalent in terms of deaths of a 9/11 a day for the next 60 to 90 days. So it's hard right now to see where this ends, but we're talking about hopefully 100 million people. That's what Joe Biden, the president-elect, is talking about, having been vaccinated by the end of February, in which case we're talking about, the summer things starting to get to some kind of normality, I guess.
Darshini, when will it be over, as they say?
It can't come too soon, can it, Lise? Frankly, there's been a game of snakes and ladders, hasn't there? On the one hand, good news about vaccines. On the other hand, new variants being discovered. When it comes to the survival of our livelihoods, the good news is the financial vaccination, the money injected by policymakers, has been going on for some time. That should bridge us through the crisis. But I think ultimately, even if we get back on our feet physically by later in 2021, it could take another year or even more for our economies to get back to full strength again.
Justin?
I think it'll probably take longer than spring for us to get out of it, particularly if we think about vaccinating the world population rather than just the populations of developing countries. But I'm also interested in the way it will have changed all our attitudes to our lives and our world, and whether it means that we're going to be kind of put our shoulder behind the effort to tackle global warming, for example.
And last but not least, in Brussels, Katja.
Across Europe, I think people who have sort of almost given up on Christmas joy and festive cheer are focusing their hopes and dreams on Easter. It's sort of generally accepted that mask wearing might just have to continue, though, throughout the summer and perhaps into next autumn.
I think everyone will be hoping that 2021 will not be a year like 2020. But of course, as you've all underlined, there are still challenges to come. Darshini, let's get a few more details. Use a broad brush for us. What do you expect to see in the UK economy in 2021 amid warnings of what's called a double dip recession?
I think a double dip recession is pretty much a given now, Lisa. I think that ship has really sailed. I mean, what we've seen, obviously, is large swathes of the economy being shut down, not once, but twice. And who knows what's going to happen in the new year as well. I mean, I think as well as looking at what's been happening there, and it's inevitable, isn't it? You just looked outside your window, you can see the doors are shut. You can see exactly what's going on up and down our high streets across the country. But the good news, of course, is that there is money being pumped in by the likes of the Bank of England and also the Chancellor of the Exchequer as well. So that is going to help to tide us through to some extent, but there are people falling through the gaps. So even though we might see the economy growing again in the second half of, let's say, 2021, we may see unemployment continue to rise for some time. And don't forget, people, if they lose their jobs now and go in for long periods of unemployment, that can have impacts on your lives 10, 20, even 30 years down the track. So not one to be taken lightly, I don't think.
And Katja, from Europe, where even the German powerhouse is struggling.
Yes, although, I mean, I think that now that Germans can't go out and drink Glühwein with each other in the streets, they're sort of passing the time by pointing the finger at one another, at politicians, at various newspapers, or whoever they can blame for the fact that although the country was perceived to have done so well in the first wave of COVID-19, in the second wave it is suffering quite miserably. But if you actually have a look at the figures, the death rate in Germany is extremely low, 3 times lower than neighbouring France, for example, also than the UK, also than Spain or Italy. And because this autumn, against Chancellor Angela Merkel's wishes, by the way, the regional governors voted for lockdown light rather than a hard lockdown, which they have now imposed, it means that the economy was able to sort of bounce back to a certain extent. So I think once the Germans have finished nörgeln, which is their verb for fussing and bitching and moaning, they may look back and say that this has been a misery across the whole continent, COVID-19, but actually their country so far hasn't fared as badly as many of their neighbours.
Aleem, I'm going to bring you in from the other side of the world and from this different angle. I'm not going to repeat the German word that Katja used, but not just moaning, but actually protests, because COVID-19 also showed us about how the virus was able to expose inequality and its disproportionate impact in the United States, African Americans, as well as Hispanic and Latino communities, the poorer sections of society. Could this lead in 2021, not just to the health issues that you talked about continuing, but also more protests in the streets?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it's really stark statistics when it comes to those minorities who have been affected. 2.8 times as many black people in terms of the proportion of society here died during this pandemic so far as compared to white Americans. And I can't think of another country where this virus was as politicized as it was here in the US. We had all these protests by Republicans in Democrat-run states when mask mandates or lockdown mandates were issued, and those protests are likely to continue into the new year because we've been hearing from President-elect Biden and Kamala Harris that they want everyone to wear a mask for the first 100 days, and they're going to have a lot of trouble imposing those kinds of mandates or advice even. And there is a sense that Donald Trump, of course, has also been, throughout this pandemic, overly optimistic about where it was heading, hasn't really addressed those kind of racial issues. And Katya was talking about the potential political impact on European leaders next year. We may have already seen, of course, the political impact of this virus on one leader in Donald Trump, because at the start of the year, a lot of people couldn't see how he lost this election.
Justin, you mentioned in your comments about whether there'll be vaccines for all. I mean, there is going to be this challenge to keep manufacturing the vaccines and getting them not just to the wealthy countries, but also to the less privileged countries. Now, the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine very much calls itself a vaccine for the world. And that mantra that's been said time and again by humanitarian leaders, that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Of course, world leaders have to think of their own populations first, but will they think of others too?
Well, there was an unseemly rush at the beginning of all of this, wasn't there, as developed countries kind of went around the pharmaceutical companies kind of buying up, forward purchasing vaccine, not knowing whether it worked or not, but buying it up anyway. And billions of doses, 6.4 billion doses, something like that, were bought up by the developed world. Obviously raising the question, because those are vaccines then that can't go to the developing world unless, of course, we get lots and lots of vaccine successes, lots of vaccines prove to be effective, in which case there'll be oversupply which can spill back into less affluent countries. But there are efforts worldwide to make sure that vaccines are delivered to developing countries. So there's a vaccine plan called COVAX, which is an initiative of a vaccines alliance founded and funded by Bill Gates, called Gavi, the WHO, the World Health Organization, and something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. They've got together with an aim to inoculate at least a fifth of, I think it's 92 developing countries, the fifth of the population of 92 developing countries. And the idea is to get richer countries to buy, as they sign up vaccines for their populations, to buy up vaccine for developing countries.
And of course, you can't emphasize it enough that the vaccine is really the bright light for everyone, that a hope for some way out of this crisis. Gabriel, you're sitting here nodding. Please, I think we all need it. There's been so much bad from this pandemic, but are there bright spots that we can look to in 2021?
Well, look, as you say, the vaccine, I mean, Russia's got a vaccine. In sort of inimitable Russian style, Dmitry Kiselyov, who's a state TV presenter, sort of seen as a mouthpiece of the Kremlin, said that their vaccine, called the Sputnik, was unpretentious and reliable like the Kalashnikov, a slightly sinister kicker in the end there. But the Russians are certainly hoping they're rolling out this vaccine now. They're certainly hoping that's going to have a big effect. Russia, I think, has the fourth highest number of infections in the world at the moment, so they've been quite hard hit. Although, actually, if you look at their economy, it's done slightly better than, say, the UK, other European countries, and the US, perhaps coming from a lower bar, but also they had less severe lockdowns. That doesn't mean that Russia is out of the woods in 2021. A lot of people in Russia don't trust the vaccine. I think that'll probably chime with Aleem in Washington. I think there's quite a lot of mistrust in the US as well, as you mentioned. But up to 60% of Russians say they don't trust it, they won't take it. So then the question is, are the Russian numbers accurate? A lot of people wondering about that as well. If they aren't, can the healthcare system cope? And is Russia going to be out of the woods by spring? Possibly not.
Darshini, just a little mini prediction from you. Let's say the vaccine, the rollout does finish, after Easter, by the summer. Do you think that people will go back to the old ways, go back to the high street to shop, go back to the office to work, or have these actually been fundamental changes in our lives?
Lisa, I think there will be fundamental changes to the way that we do live our lives from day to day, and that, of course, a lot of that will be around the way we work. But if you look at the economies in general, which have been most hard hit, I mean, the likes of the UK, Spain, France, they're countries which are big on being social, where a lot of money comes in through things like hospitality, and also countries where people want to visit, and those are the ones that have been most heavily punished. So those are the ones that have the most to gain once that vaccine is rolled out, because a lot of people actually do have money stashed away during this crisis. Some incomes have gone down, but people haven't been spending as much in general. I mean, take the UK. There's an extra £100 billion stashed away in bank accounts right now. That's money that's likely to be spent. There's likely to be that pent-up demand and that will to go out there and have the kind of experiences we've been missing out on. So I'm quite hopeful that once we do see that vaccine getting a substantial hold, that we are going to see perhaps a return to more normal life. And even though some things will have changed and we'll get more used to working from home and the rest of it, and perhaps our city centres will look quite different, there will be that kind of mini boom to be unleashed.
Oh, magical words, hope, mini boom. Those are the words we really want to hear as 2021 begins. Well, it's time now to test all of your prediction skills, because leaders will be tested next year, not just by the continuing cost of this virus. I want to ask all of you, who will you be watching? I'll start with Gabriel, who's sitting next, socially distanced from me in the studio, and then in alphabetical order to my colleagues at various points around the world. Gabriel, who will you watch?
Well, look, I'm going to stick with Russia and say Alexei Navalny. Now, he was poisoned by a form of Novichok in Siberia, flown to Germany, where he's currently on the mend. You know, he's defying predictions there. He could easily have died. And he says, as soon as he's better, he's going to go back to Russia. Now, there's two ways of looking at this. You could say, you're mad, right? They're trying to kill you. Why are you going back? They could kill you. You could say this is the most courageous man in Russia right now. Either way, I think it's clear that the Kremlin fears him and they will be trying to prevent him from going back. But if he does go back, he's going to make waves in 2021.
Alim?
I'm going to say Deb Haaland, who has been nominated by Joe Biden to be the first Native American to lead the Department of the Interior. And she was, in 2018, one of the first two Native American women to be elected to the House of Representatives. And, you know, given the history of the Department of the Interior and its history of oppression against Native American people, it's an extraordinary appointment. And, you know, when a former Secretary of the Interior once said that it was the goal to either civilize or exterminate Native American people, I think Deb Haaland is going to be someone to watch in that position.
Darshini?
Janet Yellen, the woman nominated to be the US Treasury Secretary. She was also previously the head of the Federal Reserve. So the US have beaten us. They're likely to have a woman doing both of the top financial jobs when we've had none. But ultimately, the American consumer makes up more than 10% of the global economy by value. So really, what they get up to next year is going to dictate all of our fates.
Justin?
I'm going to choose a man who is not by any means the most prominent British politician, but who will be playing a very important role in a crucial conference next year. So I'm choosing Alok Sharma, who's the UK's Secretary of State for Business, but who's also heading up COP26, the Conference of the Parties, number 26. Makes it sound terribly dull, but it is the latest of the UN's climate conferences. It's a terribly important one. It's being held in the UK in Glasgow in November, and it's very important because it's actually 6 years. It was going to happen in 2020, but was moved forward because of the pandemic to 2021, and is crucial because it's the opportunity for the world to come together and ratchet up promises for reducing carbon emissions, to raise ambition. It follows on from Paris in 2015, the first time the world agreed, every nation of the world agreed that they all needed to play a role in tackling climate change. This then tries to, get them to really commit to deep carbon cuts. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, says that as far as he's concerned, 2021 is a make or break year for tackling climate, and if it is made, it will be made in Glasgow in November.
Just before I come to you, Katya, my person of the year is the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. He's likely to become king in 2021, and that will make him one of the most powerful players in the region and beyond. He's already making common cause with new allies like Israel to push back against President-elect Biden's plans to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. And he'll also push back if it's expected. President-elect Biden puts human rights on the agenda. Right, your turn now, Katya.
I am not going to watch a person in 2021. I'm going to watch an ever-lengthening shadow behind Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, as she walks away towards Germany's parliamentary elections at the end of September 2021. And the reason I'm interested in the shadow is because who takes over as German Chancellor, and Angela Merkel as she sort of bows out of the race, that will have a massive impact, not just on Germany, but on European politics, EU politics, because Angela Merkel has played this pivotal role, a role that Emmanuel Macron in France has dreamt of, but actually never managed to play. And also, Germany is seen as such an important link between the EU and the US, the incoming Biden administration. Obviously, Angela Merkel will be there for the first months, but Joe Biden will be aware that she will be on her way out. And I think that whereas we saw Barack Obama look to Angela Merkel as, you know, almost handing her the baton of protecting liberal values in the world, I don't know that at the moment the three favourites to succeed Angela Merkel and probably to win the general election then are three slightly ageing middle-aged white men, and just a very different prospect to what we've become used to from Mutti, as she's nicknamed Mummy in Germany. So I think that's really something to watch, is that shadow.
Very interesting. Brilliant predictions. Will they be correct? Well, just to remind you and our listeners, some of our predictions from last year when we asked who are the people to watch. Katja, you said last year Ursula von der Leyen. Not a bad, actually 100% there, because she is in the headlines, certainly as 2020 ended. Our North America editor, John Sopel, picked Joe Biden as the Democrat candidate. Well done, John. And Gabriel, you picked Yegor Shukov, who, of course, is an ally of the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. It was Navalny who perhaps dominated this year, so you get a half a point for last year. And you tried again this year by choosing Alexei Navalny. So the pandemic really defined 2020. But as we've heard from Aleem, so did US President Donald Trump. On January 20th, though, President-elect Joe Biden takes office with his new team, some of them familiar faces from former President Obama's time. President Trump will have his President of the United States Twitter account taken from him, but he's still certain to unleash tweets from his own account, at Real Donald Trump. At the time of recording, nearly 89 million followers, and of course tens of millions of people voted for him. Aleem in Washington, what will be the first priority, top of the in tray for President Biden?
Of course, it's going to be dealing with some of what we've already been talking about, which is rolling out this vaccine and helping turn around some of the economic numbers here, which don't look too bad for the big corporations, for the stock market. But if you look at those at the bottom, things look really dire, particularly for women, particularly for minorities who've lost jobs, who can't make rent, who can't pay bills. And that is going to be a huge thing to turn around. That will be the first focus. But as I mentioned before, the politicization of all of those efforts is likely to continue, as are a lot of the problems. You know, you take away the figurehead, but these issues of polarization across this country don't go away. The race issues, you know, so much protest happened, so many people took to the streets. There's been very little in terms of structural change on race and policing over the last year, so we can expect that to fire up again at some stage when there's an incident somewhere in the country. And we have had a year, because of the pandemic in some ways, where there have been few mass shootings. That's obviously gone down this year. But there are fears over the coming year, with the huge numbers of people that now belong to militias of all kinds of persuasions across the country, that there might still be some political violence. It's a pretty bleak prediction, but it's one that a lot of people are making. So bringing the country together and the pandemic are the two big ones for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but then there are all the other associated issues with fixing the immigration system, the asylum system, reuniting children who were separated from their parents under that system, under Donald Trump, healthcare, all of those kind of issues. But the big ones are really uniting this country.
Does the success or failure of President Biden's agenda hinge on the results of the two runoff Senate elections in the state of Georgia on January the 5th?
I think that will have a huge bearing on what he's able to do in Congress, because if there is a Republican-led Senate, then he's going to face the same roadblocks that he faced when he was vice president and Barack Obama was president. For a lot of that term, there was a lot of intransigence. And he's likely to face the same thing. But I think even without that, there is a smaller Democratic majority in the House of Representatives as well. So he's going to face a tough time whatever happens, but he is playing the card, and he's playing it relatively well so far, that he is a uniter. He's someone who can reach across the aisle. I think in reality, you've got 73 million people across this country, more than went out to vote for Donald Trump in 2016, who still wanted more of that administration. And many of those don't believe that Joe Biden is in power legitimately or will be in power legitimately. And so whether or not he had the support in Congress, he still faces an uphill battle convincing the American electorate that he's doing the right thing.
Gabriel, quick fire from you. What will be the first test for President Biden's team abroad?
Well, the big test is, and as Aleem said, you take away the figurehead, but the issues remain the same. And the big test for Joe Biden will be the same as it was for Donald Trump, and that's China. China is an existential threat to America's global dominance. This is about who makes the rules of the world. America's made them for decades. Now China is champing at the bit. So that's one. And in a sense, I think there's bipartisan agreement on the fact that China is a threat.
Darshini, how would you see the world when it comes to Joe Biden's first test?
And obviously, one of the things that really struck me during the campaign is how similar in some ways, you don't hear this often, but how similar President Trump and Biden's underlying motivation is, and that is American jobs. And I think that is going to be the overriding message of 2021 in the Biden administration. But how does China play into that? And how do you go about tackling that? I mean, of course, we saw with Trump, it was very much a case of building up those walls, conflict face to face, and just going out there and being quite aggressive. I think what we're going to see with Biden is perhaps easing of tensions with Europe and trying to get them on side and coming up to get them to actually confront this common enemy, China and its ambitions together. But if you're playing purely a numbers game, I mean, China is going to overtake America, however you look at it, on a pure numbers game within a matter of years.
Katya, a sigh of relief in Brussels, a leader who wants to build multilateralism, not break it?
Yes, I mean, it's no secret, is it, that the EU as a whole did not get on very well. Donald Trump, they found his unpredictability very hard to deal with and his emotional outbursts appalling. And he seemed to reserve particular ire for big EU power Germany with, trade war threats and arguing over defence spending. But I think, as we've already alluded to here, the EU sees in Joe Biden, yes, somebody who will be more collegiate, who believes in multilateralism. The Baltic states are very relieved that he's a great supporter of NATO, for example. However, they think, as Darshini was saying, it's still America first. It's just in different tones. The EU still expects big tensions over trade, over big tech and how to tax them, for example, and also about data protection and the flow of data. So they don't expect that to change under Joe Biden.
Darshini, I'm just going to bring you in just very quickly. Where will Britain be on the list of priorities? There was a famous warning from President Obama in 2016 that Britain would be at the back of the queue when it came to a trade deal. That may have been about politics, but where will it fit now?
I was just going to bring up this exact point here because, clearly, we've all been, trying to think about that special relationship. What we've heard from Joe Biden, the noises we're getting, is that in actual fact, we're still pretty much way down that list when it comes to priorities. And I don't think what we've seen happening in recent months has changed that at all. I mean, on the one hand, what I'm hearing from the UK government is, look, we do know that what the Biden administration wants out of a trade deal with the UK is pretty much the same as what the US wants under Trump, which is, for example, greater access for its farmers. So when you're talking about things like chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef, those kind of asks are likely to be the same. And don't forget that the US is the UK's biggest individual trading partner if you're looking at it by individual countries. But all the indications are that the Biden administration is in no hurry to get that deal done. They're very happy to let the UK sweat over this one. And when you look at that inbox that Joe Biden's got, I'm afraid to say it looks like we've moved down that queue a little bit further. So this is a big blow to the UK government, don't forget, because they were hoping to get this deal signed up as the first major victory of the UK having its freedom under Brexit.
Oh dear, I think we need a bit of good news. Justin, there could be good news possibly even on day one of the new administration when it comes to climate change.
Oh, I think there certainly will be. I mean, there's a sort of smoking U-turn in terms of climate policy in America as Biden takes the reins. He's committed to this huge kind of green stimulus package. He's hoping to spend, if he can get it through the Senate, of course, $2 trillion on kind of decarbonising the American energy networks, investing in charging points for electric cars, all sorts of things. So it's a massive change of direction. He'll sign up again to the Paris Agreement, and therefore will be part of the negotiations that we've mentioned already in Glasgow in November. It makes an absolutely huge difference to those negotiations to have America, still the largest economy, just as Darshini says, still holding on to the title of largest economy in the world. So massive advantage to have.
Gabriel.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Justin. You say, he's got this $2 trillion green stimulus package that he wants to push through if he can get it through the Senate. Now, we've got these Senate runoffs in Georgia on the 5th of January. That will decide who controls the Senate. If the Republicans end up controlling the Senate, he's going to have a very tough time getting this through the Senate. So even though we might see good intentions and good noises coming from the United States, the reality, again, might not be that different from what we saw under Donald Trump. And it's quite interesting to look at the difference between the American systems and, let's say, the Chinese. These are the two biggest countries that you really need to sign up to try and save the planet. Now, the Chinese have just put a date on their going carbon net zero. And of course, they're doing this in a one-party state. Whatever Xi Jinping decides, that goes. So if they're on board, then that's likely to happen. Whereas in America, you've got this system which vacillates, goes backwards and forwards according to the whims of democratic politics. So in a sense, these are the two big competing systems that are now becoming the engine of conflict and potential cooperation in the world. It's the US, the democratic US, versus China, the one-party state.
Well, as 2020 ended, there were many announcements of more ambitious targets by countries to become carbon neutral. Darshini, in Britain, we had Prime Minister Boris Johnson talking about a 68% cut on 1990 levels by the year 2030. That was praised by climate activists, but also called a colossal challenge. Does the business make sense? How much is this going to cost?
A lot. But, it's fascinating because I think when you look at the changes we've seen, we've talked about changes to the way of working and how this virus will change us. I think quietly behind the scenes, what we've seen over the last few years is a revolution in business thinking, that this isn't some nice to have or something you just stick in a line in your ESG report at the end of the year to make sure that everyone sort of feels that you're warm and fuzzy and cozy and the rest of it. This is actually part of building back better. And I've been struck by the number of, for example, investment banks and big money managers who've been taking pledges this year to take on board climate change and to make sure that our money is invested more wisely and that returns take account as well of various goals. And that isn't something you expect to see from the people who are used to worrying about the bottom line, particularly during a crisis like this. So yeah, the cost is going to be huge, but I think it is something that we have seen this behavioural change happening, particularly in the UK. That means that is something that businesses are realising it's something they're going to have to bear.
And Katya, Europe very much wants to be seen as a global leader when it comes to the climate emergency.
Yeah, and I heard your plea, Lise, that we bring something more positive to you. And so I think that Brussels has been banging on, if you like, about its Green Deal for a long time. And it's always one of these ideals when a new commission comes into town and then, migration crisis or Euro crisis, COVID-19 happens and, off it goes and everyone forgets about the Green Deal, except not quite this time. Because the EU is going to try to pull together, it's got this massive COVID-19 recovery fund to try and help the EU economies that have been worst affected by the COVID-19 crisis back on their feet. It's not exactly altruism on behalf of the richer member states. It's because every single EU country is linked to the single market. So if one country does extremely badly, a big country, it pulls everybody down with them, if you like. But what they're going to do is try and link some of those recovery funds to environmentally friendly actions in member state countries. So what the EU is hoping is that through the decimation of COVID-19, they can really introduce their Green Deal into the individual member countries of the European Union and help governments or regions of the EU become greener and more environmentally efficient.
Well, indeed. And Alim, the United States, the world's second largest emitter, is really saying this is going to be the priority. He even has a climate czar, and the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, he's got a big climate team. But of course, a lot of climate deniers in the United States too. So how do you see 2021?
Indeed, but at least there won't be one in the White House. And, you know, there was a lot of outrage associated with Donald Trump, with what he said, with his tweets, with the insults. But really, a lot of critics will look at his biggest sort of negative legacy, and they'll look at climate change. His administration was in the process of reversing more than 100 environmental regulations, a lot of them to do with emissions, car emissions, power plant emissions, and they reversed more than 80 of those. And they had someone in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency at one point, Scott Pruitt, who'd spent their entire career attacking the Environmental Protection Agency and who'd been a lobbyist for oil and gas firms. So that'll be different. And I know what Gabriel was saying about the difficulties in passing legislation through the Senate, but a lot of, as many people see it, the damage that Donald Trump did was through executive orders, edicts from the White House, and those are things that can be reversed by Joe Biden. A lot of environmentalists, though, say, given this ever-shrinking window that the world has to deal with this crisis, a lot of damage has been done over the past 4 years. But certainly from day one, you mentioned John Kerry as climate envoy, and Joe Biden have already said that they will be doing a lot in the first few days of the administration to try and address some of, as they see it, the damage done by Donald Trump.
And Justin, back to you. Prepare us a little bit. As Alim says, a lot of damage has been done, but the 2020 we heard words like the world's hottest day, the most melting, the worst hurricane.
Second hottest year ever.
What should we be preparing for in 2021?
Well, I can't forecast the weather for you. I'm sorry about that, Lise.
But this is it's the prediction hour now.
Okay, well, we won't do weather forecasts. Look, I'd like to go back to a really optimistic trend in environment that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is when we saw President Xi step forward at the UN General Assembly in September and commit China to going carbon neutral by 2060. That was a very, very unusual action for any country to make. Normally, climate negotiations are an enormous haggle, a kind of great carpet shop where people kind of trade deals with each other. I'll do this if you do that. President Xi stood up in front of the General Assembly and said, we are going to cut carbon emissions to net zero, to neutrality by 2060, regardless of what anyone else does. We don't care if President Trump in America doesn't do it, if Europe doesn't deliver on its climate pledges, we're going to do it anyway. Partly that, I think, was an attempt to kind of wrong foot President Trump and present China as a kind of potential world leader, something Gabriel's already talked about, that division there between America and China. But it was also because there's been a fundamental change in the underlying economics of tackling climate change. There's been a huge reduction in the cost of renewable technology, and I mean solar power, wind power, batteries, the whole kit caboodle is much cheaper than it used to be. The International Energy Agency says that solar power in some countries now is the cheapest energy the world has ever known. And so we're getting to the point where the cheapest possible energy is the energy that is green. So at that point, the momentum gets behind tackling climate change. And I think that's something the Chinese have seen. This isn't just an edict by a dictator. It's a president seeing what's in the best interest for his country and knowing that there's a huge first mover advantage for countries that are willing to invest in these technologies early. There's a huge kind of potential market out there as the rest of the world follows suit, not because they're hair shirt kind of, tree huggers, but because it is economically the best thing for countries to do. I think that's enormously optimistic, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how that new kind of calculus of cutting carbon informs these big climate negotiations in November in Glasgow.
So we will all be watching the climate. We have to. But what about the places that we should be watching in 2021? And this could be a flashpoint or a rallying point. Gabriel, quick predictions.
I'm going to go with Taiwan because I'm not saying it's going to be a flashpoint. I'm not saying there's going to be war, but in the past few months, we've seen increased bellicose rhetoric, both from Beijing and from Washington over Taiwan, which Beijing still claims as a renegade province, but is increasingly going its own way. And if there's a physical place that embodies this question and this competition between the US and China over who makes the rules of the world, it is Taiwan. So I think that's a place to watch.
Aline.
I'm just going to go a little bit further than the borders of the US and point to a place which has not been in the headlines over recent weeks, and that is Venezuela, which is seeing a renewed humanitarian crisis with the coronavirus that has left even more people impoverished, left even more people unable to support their families, and it feels like that's building up once again to some form of flashpoint.
Darshini? I'm going to stick pretty close to home, actually, Lise, and go with Dover, by which I mean a shorthand for any of our major ports here in the UK. And, of course, those are areas that have been in the headlines of late. But I think with the end of the transition period upon us, we are now at a point whereby what happens, deal or no deal with Brexit, there are changes. And those changes will dictate the fate of the UK economy. I mean, how those changes bed down and also how we react to those changes will dictate, frankly, the prosperity of all of us over the next year to come. It will dictate exactly how strong that recovery, that bounce back is after this virus and its effects are being shaken off.
Justin?
Well, I would go for Scotland because of Glasgow, but I think I've talked enough about Glasgow, so I'm going to go for a slightly weird choice. I'm going to go for Denmark. And I'm going to go for Denmark because it's home to a company called Ørsted, which used to be called Dong. It used to be Danish Oil and Natural Gas, but Ørsted transitioned to being a renewable energy company. It hopes to be the first renewable super major. Super major is what we used to call the giant oil companies that dominated the oil business. It hopes to do the same for renewable energy. It's a huge player here in Britain as well. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. It's a direction that many other oil companies are following. It took the lead and is doing very well with it. So let's see how all that plays out in Denmark.
Katya?
I'm going to go for Italy as Europe editor, and I'd like to quote you some deep and meaningful poet or something, but I'm going to go for the great bard Chumbawamba, who wrote a song called I Get Knocked Down But I Get Up Again. Italy normally, it got hit very hard in the 2008 economic crisis. It's always reeling from one political crisis to another. It's been hit so hard with the COVID-19 crisis. Per 100 people affected with COVID-19, it has one of the highest death rates in the whole world. And I just wonder how it's going to deal with all of that.
And finally, my place to watch this year is Afghanistan. September brings the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, which led to the fall of the Taliban. Astonishingly, this is the year they will come closer, if not return to power, either through the historic peace talks, which began in 2020, or through the battlefield. Who would have made that prediction in 2001? Afghans will be hoping that world leaders won't forget the mantra of that time: we are with you for the long run. And now, my dear colleagues, the real test of your prowess, since we are recording before January 1st, I have to ask all of you, will there be a trade deal between the United Kingdom and Europe? And depending on your answer, what do you expect to see? Darshini?
Oh, Lise, the economist in me says, yes, there will be a deal simply because there is so much at stake in financial terms. But if we've learnt anything in 2020, Brexit isn't about the economics, is it? It's about the politics and the sovereignty. And so therefore, I think the flavour of 2021 when it comes to the post-Brexit era will be fudge. We will see some kind of a deal, but there'll still be stuff to be hammered out.
Katya in Brussels.
I don't think it's so much of a fudge. I think one of the things that's really going to hit us in 2021 is that even if there is a deal, it's a very narrow deal because, this is at best a hard Brexit and at worst a no-deal Brexit. And I say at worst because, of course, if you voted for Brexit for national sovereignty reasons, you'll be happy deal or no deal. But the economic impact will become clear in 2021. I mean, we've had predictions from the Bank of England to say that maybe not in the short term compared to COVID-19, but in the long term, a no-deal Brexit will have a much larger economic impact than COVID-19. And there are particular industries in the United Kingdom that if the EU and the UK are trading on World Trade Organization terms with all the tariffs that go along with that say they will be decimated. If you're a lamb farmer, for example, or you sell cars or you need car parts, you will be really hit by World Trade Organization tariffs. Even in the case of a deal, the changes when it comes to borders and customs, paperwork is going to be huge. And there are so many subjects that even if there is a deal that aren't being dealt with, that we still need to find out. What about financial services, for example? What about travel with your pet? Will it be eased? That may be laughable, but for many people, they want to go on holiday to France with Boris the dog. If you rely on a guide dog, it's imperative that you can travel easily with your dog. None of that is being dealt with. So a deal, if there is one, will be narrow, but it will improve relations between the two sides, and it's something that you can then build up when it comes to services. Of course, the UK economy, 80% of the UK economy is service-based, but actually this deal, even if there is one, doesn't deal much with services. So if you have a deal in place, you can build on it afterwards. And if you don't, it really depends. Is it a very acrimonious no deal? That'll make it hard for the two sides to sit back together again in 2021 with not just economic impact, but geopolitical as well. And that's something that Germany's Angela Merkel has been very aware of right from the start. She wants the UK close to work when it comes to Iran or China or any of those other issues. She doesn't want bad blood between the two sides.
Justin.
I'm with Darshini and Katya. I think it looked like no deal, didn't it? And I think now they're going to sneak a very, very narrow deal over the line, raising all those questions that Darshini and Katya have already mentioned. I think it's going to be a very, very uncomfortable new year for the UK.
I'm going to duck the question, Lise, but what this whole tension over sovereignty versus dynamic alignment shows is that this is all about who makes the rules. Does Britain make the rules or does the EU make the rules? And we're going to find out who it is in 2021.
And indeed, we'll find out about that around the world as well, if the United States, which retreated from many parts of the world, will actually return, or if indeed the world that was reshaped in 2020 will continue to be the world of 2021. How we all hope that we have seen the worst of it in 2020. But, there's always a little bit of a light. If 2021 turns out to be as bad, oh God forbid, if worse than 2020, don't forget that for those who follow the Persian solar calendar, March the 21st marks the turn of the century and the start of the year 1400. So we can follow a different calendar and let's all banish 2020. I want to take this moment to thank all of our listeners. We wish you a happy, safe, and healthy 2021. And to you, my colleagues, Gabriel Gatehouse, socially distanced with me here in the studio, Ali Makbul in Washington, Darshini David in London, Justin Rolat also in London, and Katya Adler in Brussels. Happy New Year to you and to yours.
The Correspondent's Look Ahead was produced by Ben Carter.
On BBC One and iPlayer.